Legend Master. That sounded absolutely completely lame. Your Legend Master. I am Christopher Balzano, the crazy man who takes you on these journeys throughout Florida and beyond on Tripping on Legends to explore not only what we have here, but in the great state of Florida, but also beyond, and making connections between the stories that are popular in this state to the stories that are popular in your state. We are streaming live on Midnight FM, midnight.fm, where it's always midnight. Tonight we're also coming to you on IGTV. So if you're not following us on Instagram yet, it is at Spooky Tripping. And of course, we are on Facebook Live as well through facebook.com/tripping on legends. I don't think we found a way to go live on Twitter yet, but our Twitter is at Spooky Balzano. And it's an unusual episode tonight. It's an episode that I think is going to kind of go some places, and hopefully it goes places where the audience wants to take it as well. Because there are a few different things. This is episode 79, and I've named it the Seven Sisters Situation. It's really hard because I've found that I have a list that comes out. And saying Seven Sisters Situation might as well be the sequel by the feature. I am missing several things tonight. The first of which is my Robert Dahl coffee, which I usually drink from, and then my Gemini cup is dirty, so I am tonight drinking from Spooky Empire, which is, I guess, an unfortunate reminder that there is no Spooky Empire. There is no Spooky Empire. So I had an amazing time. It was a game-changing movie last year. But like many of the events and occasions that make up the month of October, tagging along on an investigation. I still want to do that. Hopefully, they're gonna be at that investigation late. But I was approached this week, courtesy of Mark Muncy, who was unable to do it, by a group, and I believe it's called Macbeth and Cheese Playhouse, who wanted to feature a night of ghost stories with Christopher Balzano. And it's kind of interesting because we have a whole bunch of interesting things planned for it. And by interesting things planned means it's stirring around in my brain because they approached me yesterday at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So we're still kind of figuring out exactly what this event is going to be. But I will give you more details. It is in Ruskin, Florida. So if you're in that area and you don't have any plans the night before Halloween, make sure you're following me on my social media platforms so you can kind of get more details as to what that show is going to be like and when it's going to be and all the kind of specifics of it. Essentially, I believe it's going to be me doing my best to rob the ideas of Jeff Belanger and Andy Lake and, of course, Tim Weisberg when they did a night of haunted ghost stories or a night of New England ghost stories at a theater. So I'm going to rob from them as much as I can. If you're going to rob from the greats, I say. So it's going to be an interesting thing. Make sure that you're following me at, I'm going to say them again before you can get it out of the way, at IG, at Spooky Tripping on Facebook, facebook.com/tripping on legends. And of course, I'll be putting stuff on trippingonlegends.com, which is the website. Today, today, Eddie Van Halen died. So it oddly enough fits in with what I'm talking tonight. Not that we're going to be looking for the ghost of Eddie Van Halen the way we looked for the ghosts of Randy Rhoads. But tonight, and this afternoon, I was overwhelmed by the amount of posts that happened on all of social media when it was discovered that Eddie Van Halen had died. And you guys all know what I'm talking about because it's the same thing that happens when anyone influential dies. People want to be the first to announce it, and then when they hear it, they want to be part of a community that's mourning it. And so Facebook becomes just picture after picture of Eddie Van Halen or whoever the person is that died, with links to an article a lot of times, or just RIP, and then oftentimes memories. People want to relive the moment that they had with the person who has passed. And it's interesting because we take these celebrities as part of our lives, and especially if they've touched our lives. And people usually put something, I love them in this, if it's an actor or an actress, or they post a picture of the tickets to the Van Halen show they went to in this case, or things like that. And nothing that I'm going to say about that is meant to attack those people at all, or to somehow belittle what they've done, because it makes complete sense. I don't think that people do it because they're like, I want to be part of the story. I think it's more of a genuine outpouring of an emotion, right? Someone you knew, someone you feel like you connected with somehow has died, and you celebrate their life and you mourn their passing by pushing out that obituary, and by pushing out whatever media you might have in connection to that person. And of course, sometimes you get it wrong, right? So sometimes the person has already died. David Bowie has died about 17 times in the last 12 years, right? Even when he was still alive. And then, of course, everyone jumps on that and tells you that you're wrong. But I was, in rolling around what we're going to talk about tonight, something kind of struck me about that. I would be surprised, baffled, thunderstruck, if you will, to learn that most people who had posted something, and most people who are, grieving, had considered Eddie Van Halen relevant in the past 20 years. Whether they had bought the Gary Sharon album when he replaced Sammy Hagar, whether they had listened to any of the music that he had made for the last 20 years. And to be honest with you, I couldn't name what that might be, right? I didn't follow his career after Sammy Hagar, and I wasn't overwhelmed the way I am not overwhelmed by most famous people dying, because I don't know them, right? They have their legacy. I can still listen to any Van Halen song I want. I can still listen to Eruption and be blown away by it. I can still listen to Ain't Talking About Love, which is my favorite. But I don't. It doesn't impact me. It doesn't affect me. Not because I'm soulless, not because I'm heartless, but because, like, he's done. Like, he's only part of my world for a little bit, and then he comes in, he comes out. But it struck me as people were feeling what they were expressing as grief, right? Like, why do I care whether Eddie Van Halen has died? To me, he's been dead for 20 years. I've never seen him live. I've never, and that's not trying to be harsh. That's just trying to say, like, the reality of it is that he is a landmark, right? He is a touchstone in music and rock and roll, but that's about all he is to me, right? It's not an emotion. There's not an emotion there. If you're following me on the social media, then you notice that I posted something today, which I think is relevant to what we're talking about today. Not Eddie Van Halen, although they're connected, right? They're connected. Is this idea of, does the paranormal need its landmarks? And this article was originally published probably 10 years ago at least. Back when I was doing the news for Ghost Village, I posted it. It's an article I wrote really kind of examining if and why the paranormal needs these touchstone, overly famous landmarks, right? Whether we need these cases that transcend time, that are in our conscious mind, they are part of the landscape of the paranormal, even though we've never been there, even though we often will say, like, it's on my bucket list, to go to these places. We know more about them than we know about our local haunts sometimes, right? We know the backstories, we know what's been there. They are heavily promoted by the media. You can, for the most part, go to these places and pay, sometimes reasonable amount, oftentimes not a reasonable amount, to investigate them because they are a landmark, right? They are one of those places that everyone has deemed necessary in the paranormal world. For those of you guys who are listening live, whether it is on IG or on Facebook, and even that little app that I don't know, but the people on Midnight.fm use it quite a bit. I would love to hear, while we're doing these, while I'm doing this episode, I would love to hear Discord. That Discord is what I'm thinking about. I would love to hear what your paranormal landmarks are, right? What are the places within the paranormal that you guys deem to be, the sacred seven, or the ones that are better than everything else, right? When you think the paranormal, you think of this place. In a lot of ways, it is your Eddie Van Halen, and even though you've never been there, your knowledge of it and its lore and its history, and oftentimes more its mystique, carries us through, and we can rattle these places off. And I'll give you my favorite example, and that's the Stanley Hotel. I have never been to the Stanley Hotel. For the most part, I know of it. I know a few of the stories that are associated with it. And that's about it. And yet, it is really hard to get into a conversation about ghosts and not have the Stanley Hotel come up, right? And it's almost one of those things where, like, everyone keeps telling you that it's so great that, like, now I can't stand the location. Not only because, well, there's a few reasons why, but it's interesting to me that I will be talking in Lehigh, Florida, to a group of women in their 50s and 60s, and I'll be talking about the ghosts of Ocala, or the legend of Arbuckle Creek, like random things that are Florida, right? And someone will throw out, have you been to the Stanley Hotel? And I'll, of course, say, no, I haven't. And then they'll proceed to tell me about it. And it's just interesting because everybody assumes if you're into ghosts, you've been to the Stanley Hotel. And if you talk about ghosts or get paid to talk about ghosts, then you must have been to the Stanley Hotel. And I'm like, I have never been there in my life, and I have no desire to go to there. And it's not that it's a bad haunting. It's not that it's a haunting that I think is fake or anything like that. But it's definitely not on my bucket list, but it's one of those places that has to be visited. If you are into ghosts, this is a place you have to go. Does the paranormal need its landmarks, right? Does it need these places to maintain its hold, right? To, like, you never see ghost hunters, right, or ghost adventures, or these places visit, John's house for a live event on Halloween, right? It's always one of these big places, and it's it perpetuates an idea about the paranormal. It helps to form the ideas about the paranormal, and then perpetuate not only how to investigate, but what a haunted location has to be. I see in the chat room we've got the Birdcage Theater, which I know a little bit about, and then of course what would probably be one of my favorites which is the Island de la Mortis. That actually is someplace that I think would be worth the hype for me to go. Do we need that? Do we need to have some of these transcendent locations? And what do they do for the paranormal? Like, are they doing harm or are they doing good? And I mention them oftentimes, and I think we did a whole show where Natalie and I talked about a few of them, and I think it was after the event where everyone kept asking Natalie if she had been to the Stanley Hotel, and she was like, "What is that?" And I had to kind of give her some crypt notes on it, because tonight I'm talking about Seven Sisters in Ocala, Florida, which may be the most famously haunted inn in all of Florida. It is that landmark in Florida. You know, there are landmark cases such as, the Devil's Tree, or Fort DeSoto might be one, or things like the Bellamy Bridge, and of course Casadega, and all that's attached to it. So, it's Seven Sisters, which is no longer open. I should spoilers. You can't go there. As far as I know, it's no longer open. I believe it is closed, based on an interview that I was given, as well as the very clear cutoff in its Yelp and TripAdvisor reviews. So I can only assume that the place is closed. But this is right smack dab in Haunted Ocala land, right? This is in Ocala, Florida. This is maybe 2 miles away from Fort King. Not much more than that. I mean, I haven't clocked it, but I remember passing by it. And then when I was doing my interview at Fort King with one of the rangers, both of the rangers that I spoke to spoke of like Seven Sisters. Like, oh, you're going to definitely talk about Seven Sisters, right? Like, as if it was a prerequisite for what I was doing. I've noticed now Waverly Hills being mentioned. I was originally going to make a list of places that were going to be mentioned, and then like hold up the list at the end and be like, I can guess what these places are. Waverly Hills is, of course, one that I often reference. That is said to be worth the hype. Once again, no desire to go. And I think a lot of that has to do with the legend part of it, right? So we're gonna throw out. First of all, let me throw out the number in case you want to call either with one of your stories of these landmarks or to offer your opinion. And the number here is 813-418-6822. Or of course, you can just jump right into the chat room anytime if you're listening to this on podcast. 813-418-6822. If you have a story from one of these landmarks, or an argument for why they are amazing and needed and necessary to the paranormal, or why they're an abomination, why they do more harm than good. Abomination is kind of a tough word. Maybe they will just say they do more harm than good. Seven Sisters is that place, and it's some place that has been on my radar for the entire time I've been to Florida. The entire time I've lived here, mainly because one person who I worked with, Nancy Planetta, had investigated it. And actually, we're going to get into that part of the story later, because it's really the story of this book right here, which is an old book called The Lady of the Lake. Let me tell you a little bit of the history of this place. Trying to piece together, and so I've contacted a few different people who I consider experts on this, and they can feel free to call in and correct anything that I'm going to say, because trying to find the straight story on this place is on the internet is crazy. Without trying to contact some of the people who are mentioned specifically as having had owned it or having had owned it. It's really hard to get what Seven Sisters history is, but I'm going to give it to you the best that I possibly can. It was built in 1888. So I should first probably start off by saying that it is actually two buildings. It is two different places. Originally, I thought that it was seven. I thought it was seven places, but it's not. It's two buildings, one of which we can call Seven Sisters, and the other of which we can call the Scott House. And these two places collectively now are known as Seven Sisters. The first one was built in 1888, and it was the residence of the Scott family, I believe. And I wasn't able to find any information on the Scotts and who they were or anything like that. So that's another deep dive, but you're going to find out later. I'm going to kind of take a poll over whether or not this is worth the dive. That's kind of what this episode is about. We're going to call that one the Pink House, although I'm pretty sure it's no longer pink. But that is considered, in all of the kind of modern pre-2010 literature, that is known as the Pink House. And then there is the Reinhauer's house, which is technically what Seven Sisters is. And that was built in, well, at least in 1895. I believe I've got 1894, 1893. I've gotten different dates of when it was built. But it was moved into, we'll say, in 1895 by Charles Reinhauer, who is a really important person in the history of Ocala. So he was born in 1846, and in Germany, and by 1890 his family had moved here to America, and he and his brother Maurice established a clothing store. And for all intents and purposes, it was an extremely successful clothing store, and business just boomed. And as business boomed, he became more and more interested in politics. He became more and more interested in other businesses, and he seemed to have the golden touch. Everything he touched became successful, and he just got his hands into a lot of different pies. He was in metalworking, he was in forestry, and in 1925, he helped to launch the cigar empire that is so prevalent here in Florida. We think of it as Ybor City, as a Tampa thing, but it actually started in Ocala when Reinhauer kind of merged several different businesses and kind of worked with someone else, and they were able to establish this great cigar empire, which then moved. I love the line that I found that said it moved to Ybor City, which is part of Tampa, because it was a better climate. And I think it's hilarious because they're only like an hour away from each other. But maybe being on the water and stuff like that, it was better. In 1906, he actually was the mayor of Ocala. He was the second Jewish mayor for the city of Ocala. So for all intents and purposes, Reinhauer was an important man. He died in 1925. There are varying reports. Some people say that he died in the house. Other people say that he did not die in the house. But at least the lore that's passed down from it is that he passed in the house. So then that's 1925. He lived there. 1985. So 60 years later. There's a huge gap there that I have no idea what's going on with it. But in 1985, it was bought and refurbished by Jerry and Norma Johnson. So it seems at that time, that they bought both of the houses at the same time. And these houses, although I cannot find the connection between the two families, it seems to be one of those places that is like they've always been together, always been associated with each other, and I'm not sure why. Reinhauer's houses we'll call the Purple House for now. It is called the Reinhauer House, is what I'm getting. And that is officially what is considered Seven Sisters, because when Jerry and Norma Johnson bought it, they renamed it Seven Sisters after Norma's and her six sisters, right? And so each room in the house was dedicated to one of her sisters, and it was decorated in the flair. Um, it was and kind of in the style that that sister liked. There was a painting or a picture of the sister, which was kind of like the centerpiece of the room. I'm getting several people who have been there, so if you want to call in with your accounts um, from from actually staying there, the number is 813-418-6822. I know I'm saying that kind of fast, but I've got several people who are like, I've been there, and I would love to get their story. Um, that's when the paranormal reputation of the house seemed to take off, and that they seem to actively promote this as being a haunted locale. I am not sure when it happened, but at some point, the ownership went from the Johnsons to someone named Bonnie Merchant and Ken Oden, who are married or who were married, but seem to run it and seem to once again like go forward with this idea that this was a haunted place, and they are the ones who are primarily mentioned in all of the literature. This haunting has been covered by several books, not as many as I thought when I originally when I started like going through them, but it's pretty much one of those ones that's like a prerequisite for most like one time that doesn't really write paranormal books but are writing like this series of books. They all cover it, right? And it's one of those places where if it's a popular place that has been done before. So that's argument one for me not including it in the Haunted Ocala book, is the idea that it's been done before, right? It's been done before, although I have an interesting story with it, which I'm going to get to. The site has been the property has suffered several different fires. They have not been kind of put out there as being mysterious or unusual or crazy in any way, except that it seemed to be a location that is prone to fires. I want you to go back in your mind, all of my huge fans, and remember the Fort King episode we did, which also was one of those places that seemed to suffer from a lot of fires. And of course, like I said, that's only like 2 miles away, a mile, 2 miles away. One of which was a third building on the property that is no longer there. It is also said that it was, now this is a part that I think is really hard to confirm, and I'm going to call bullshit on this a little bit. I think that it's taking history and kind of using it a little bit. But it said that it was part of. Now I saw the word triage several different times in the explanation, but that it was part of the Battle of Fort King. So if you remember the whole idea behind Fort King, you had the Dade Massacre, and then you had the attack on Fort King, which happened at the same time, and the person who ran it was murdered. He was shot like 13 times or something like that. And it was a successful. Fort King used to be the buffer and kind of the go-between when it came to Native American relocation, Seminole relocation, and so it became this symbol of constantly being thrown off the land. And so it was attacked in those first opening days of the Second Seminole War. And so the lore seems to borrow from that, and it said that no, this is actually part of the property that Seven Sisters is on, was part of that war, and may have been. They kept saying the word triage, which to me means like the wounded were taken there, but that doesn't seem to make much sense, seeing that it's far away in those terms from the site of the actual fort. So I think maybe this might have been some place where the Seminoles were held up, if anything. And if you remember that episode, and I am getting that it was as of February, it was still open. Um, if you remember back to that episode, people had been whispering that the neighborhood was tainted itself, and that there was something impure, there was something wrong with the land surrounding Fort King as well as Fort King. That were odd um, there were odd experiences of mental health. There was a high level of suicide in that area. In addition to like people just experiencing ghostly things all the time in that area. Does that area extend a little bit further? Um, what I had been told about Fort King, so we can assume that this might be said for Seven Sisters as well, is that it was built where burial mounds had been. Of course, when the person told me, they probably wrongly called them Seminole ones because the Seminoles wouldn't have been burying people in that area. But maybe the Topabogan, I'm thinking, or maybe even the Timucua of that area, were when Fort King was established, it actually had kind of plowed through some of those burial mounds, and so therefore, it would have plowed through potentially the ground and the grounds that are on Seven Sisters. Although none of the stories involve Native Americans, but they're very quick to say on everything that I read and everything that I watched that this area was a triage during the Seminole Wars, and I'm like, I don't really know what that means. Back in 2009, fourth season of Ghost Hunters, Ghost Hunters went to this location. So I can officially say that I watched like my fourth episode of Ghost Hunters this week because I wanted to see what happened when they went there. And boy, was I not disappointed. It reminded me of why I don't really watch that show. Although, taking it at face value, they had a lot of really interesting things happen while they were there. So here's some of the activity that's associated with it. First of all, I should say that there are very few, if any, reports of anyone having died on the property. So all of this history, all of this time, I'm not sure there's a legend here. Strike two. I'm not sure there's an actual legend to follow up on. Now, the Ocala book isn't just of legends. But what I'm noticing is I have about a 38% level of interest in everything about this book that doesn't have to do with legends, right? Like I get really excited, the Coyote Woman and the Magician and all this stuff, and yet then I get into like something like this and I'm like, great, ghosts, woohoo. The three primary ghosts that are being seen, although there's a lot of different activity, but the ones that are physically seen are a woman in white who is said to pass through the hallways. No one can identify her. No one can see who she is. If just as a little side note, if someone who has psychic ability wants to call into the show and offer her opinion or his opinion or her opinion on whether or not these ghostly landmarks are good or bad psychically for the paranormal, I would love to hear that at 813-418-622, or just check out the chat if you happen to be in the chat, wink wink. A woman in white, I love woman in white stories, who is seen walking the halls. She passes through walls. I think I just rhymed there. And she's actually been said to check people in, right? She's actually checked people in to the hotel. Excuse me. This first level is the stuff that happens at the Scott House, the Pink House. There have also been objects moved around, and that's going to be a primary thing I'm going to talk about. There have been a boy and an older man who are seen often walking hand in hand. No one can identify who those people are. there is a man who appears in a chair, smoking a cigar. And that cigar smoke can be smelled in different sections of the room, at different places within both properties, and not with anyone nearby. Just all of a sudden, that cigar smell. Then there is so in that chair, right? That chair where they saw the person, and he's been seen there several times. And then one time, one of the people who works there, a woman by the name of Charlie Childs. That's almost about a Seven Sisters situation. I'm sorry. Is the woman in white identified as Izzy? Is that what we're saying? The woman in white is Izzy. Oh, I get what you're saying there, Jane, with the woman in the widow dress. Yes. This woman has had several different encounters. One encounter was she saw the man in the chair smoking in the chair, and then this is according to the Ghost Hunters episode. That person then threw the chair at her. Like she went and she was leaving the room, and the chair got flown at her. She also reports once she was going down the stairs and she tripped. So it's a little confusing because I've heard her tell the story different ways. In one version of the story, it seems that one thing pushes her, and then another force, unseen hands, catch her and deliver her to the bottom of the stairs unharmed. And the other version seems to just be that she falls down the stairs and then gets lifted up like someone's grabbing her from behind. So it's one way or the other. I should also mention, if you like your Ghost Hunters, when Ghost Hunters went there, they saw, or they sat in the chair, and both of them said it was noticeably colder. So there you go. Same thing. They ran up and down the stairs a few times. One of the interesting things that happened on the episode, if I'm remembering it correctly, is that one of them lost their shoes. Jason, I think, lost his shoe on the or something like that, and then it appeared in another room. And that's something that happens often in this place, which is something will disappear or be moved, and people have actually seen things move, or it appears in another room, or it kind of does this like back and forth thing. They, in one of the articles, they actually make reference to a book that has a habit of being where it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be in Sylvia's room, and then it disappears, and it appears somewhere else, and they've got to put it back in Sylvia's room. So that's kind of an interesting little thing that I'll get into a little later, too. People have heard shouts and footsteps, furniture, weird unexplained bells, like pretty much anything you want in the paranormal is there. No orbs, though. But there, Childs actually also reports having come to work one day and seeing a man who looked like Abraham Lincoln walking near the property and then kind of disappearing into the walls and into the house itself. For the most part, everything that people say is fine, right? It's more playful. It's more spooky. It's, harmless things. It's like something is there, but nothing bad happens to you, and nothing seems to be attacking you, or the vibe is a very positive vibe. Then, other than the fact that sometimes people try to trip you, which I think was a very interesting aspect of the story. But then you have the Purple House. Then you have what's actually Seven Sisters, and people have had worse encounters there, or they get a much more negative feeling there, that there is something darker. This has been the site of several different shadow men that seem to be really small that people see. In the show, they reported it as like a pet, like you would see like a good sized dog. Pukwudgie, maybe. But it's seen as like these shadow people. People go there and they have like an entirely different feeling than they do in the Scott house. It's darker. I believe that is the site where an elderly woman died in one of the rooms. but they didn't specify which room. But I'm pretty sure in one of them it said it was this quote unquote Sylvia's room, which is one of the sisters. Um, in both locations, I dig this part of it because once again, it's lore-ish stuff as opposed to just being like out there. Um, it's this idea that fires there's a hard time keeping fires going in the buildings. That people will light candles and the candles will blow out. People will, I agree, some kind of a lower being definitely. Um, People will light matches on the property. People will light cigarettes, and the cigarettes will go out. Like the lighter, as if they can't light the light, or something seems to be blowing it out. Remember that this was a place that was damaged by fire. Although there weren't any reports of anyone dying in these fires, but the fact that there had been several fires in location and people are kind of putting it out. And this activity has been reported, since at least, 1985, at least, or sometime after that. These stories have kind of come out, and they've ruled the house, right? These are what people tell. These are what's in all the books, on all the websites. People offer their explanations of it, as well as their kind of like little tidbits in terms of like, oh, I heard someone coming down the stairs. I felt like I was being watched. We stayed in the room, and we kept hearing knocking on our door all night. Of course, leave it to Backpackerverse. They have an entire story about a tub and an evil woman coming out of the tub with a doll in her hand saying something to the effect of like, oh, this is my next treat, or something like, this is my next victim, something kind of crazy. And it's funny because, if we want to just take it at face value that that's a true story, that someone reported that to them, it's kind of like what I talked about before with the paranormal PTSD, the idea of when we start to experience the paranormal and report the paranormal, the legend becomes the story. The old Liberty Valance saying, right? The legend becomes the story, and it allows for those smaller feeder things that people are talking about, those lower level entities to enter, but also for crazy stories to be made up about it. I'm going to say, if we say for the sake of value, like that really happened. Like this man really experienced in one of the upper rooms a woman coming out of the tub, very shining-ish, right? Who was holding a haunted doll and who, said something creepy like, you're my next victim. If we say that that's true, then we can kind of take a step back and say, well, you know what? Like, maybe it's allowing for certain things to happen, right? And either it's allowing for certain things to happen, or it is inviting these things in, or, like I said, paranormal PTSD, you are so used to bad stuff happening that you automatically have bad stuff happen. You think something's going to happen, and it does. I'm looking for the phrase right here. It was finally a brand new toy. That's what the saying was. Finally a brand new toy. It seems kind of far-fetched, but in an atmosphere, and let's not forget, in addition to everything that I've said, this is something that is part of the Ocala National Forest, right? It is part of that mystique. It's part of that whole darkness I've been talking about for the last 2 months as I've been researching the book. This idea that something is just plain wrong in that area. And so these lower level things would find their way there. These creepy women. I think that, we've never gone into the idea of a haunted hotel. I've never done a legend trip there. I've investigated some in my day, but we've never done a legend trip there, partly because it's the same reason why we don't do restaurants. There's money to be made. And obviously I've been to Lizzie Borden's, but the idea that there's some benefit to having a ghost in your hotel or at your restaurant. Um, that it is promoted as such. And to me, it makes complete sense. I found one reference that said it's always been a bed and breakfast or it's always been an inn. So even when the Scott House was a Scott, that seemed weird to me because I can't find any reference to people staying there until the 80s. And so almost instantly you have them talking about ghosts at that point, right? Uh, and that's a great selling point. That if you want to get people to buy stuff, you just hop right into it's haunted. And I'm thinking again, what else? We also went to the Biltmore Hotel, right? There's a whole show that I was supposed to be on if I had my passport. That new show, and Tim's a part of it in his maroon shirt. That Haunted Hotels, right? And it's hosted by Dan Aykroyd. If you don't know the story, I was supposed to be one of the talking heads, and they wanted to fly me out to do my commentary, and it was in Canada, and I couldn't go because I have no passport. And so they were like, well, maybe season 2, and I'm like, okay. That idea of a haunted hotel, someplace where you can stay and experience the paranormal, we've never really gotten into on the show because I don't do them, right? But it is that if you take the idea of a haunted place where people stay, a way station, if you will, could that be more inviting to passerbys, to spirits that are somehow trapped or unable to move on or in the area, metaphysically somehow, that hotels just draw people in. They didn't have to have died there. They didn't have to have ever stayed there even. But something about a signpost up ahead, someplace to take off your boots and rest from the road. Does that not extend to paranormal things? Could that not extend? Especially if you're talking about what has got to be the most haunted magnet in the state of Florida, right? I have a very interesting. Nancy is saying that maybe there were less things about it before the 80s because you didn't have the internet, so you didn't have things kind of being passed back and forth. That's an excellent point. Although some of the articles I have predate the internet because they're old archived ones and they don't mention anything about it. But I'm gonna talk about that part in a moment. It seems that business was not as good as you might think. In April '09, as it was being run by Bonnie Merchant and Ken Oden, the bank sold it, or the bank kind of owned them, from what I'm understanding here. And I should have one of my sisters or my mom on to explain this to me exactly, but the bank had the mortgage, and then the bank bought it from itself. Like, they paid the outstanding mortgage so that they could own it outright. This is several of these articles I just want to point out were written by Dave Schlenker, who has helped me on the Fort King stuff. So he's hopefully maybe calling in to kind of clarify some of this stuff. So April '09, it sold to the bank. It is then sold to, again, in July of that year, so a few months later, to lawyers who are kind of headed up by this gentleman whose name is Rick Perry, who in 2010 kind of moves in and converts the Pink House, so the Scott House, into lawyers' offices. So he's got the house. Him and his partners are on the first floor. The article that Dave wrote was talking about how they wanted to get other lawyers in for the second floor, and that they were hoping to maintain the other building as a hotel and have run it. And the interesting thing is that Merchant and Oden were on the property. Like, they had, maybe that's the third house that's often talked about. They had another house on the property themselves, and they were still living there. And so I think that it was hoping that they would run it. I don't know if that actually happened. So if you have information over whether Marchand and Odin continued to run it until, 2019 and maybe even 2020, that would be useful. My part in this story begins in 2010. I am writing Haunted Objects, and I'm contacted by Nancy Planeta, who we've mentioned a few times on the show, especially the early years. I tried to reach out to her, but there's been some difficulty in that. And she is an investigator who, last time I talked to her, was living in St. Pete. And she had a radio show. She was a member of the Taps family. And so I'm going to say that this happened in the wake of ghost hunters being in there. And she actually had an experience with that book that I talked about, The Lady of the Lake, it is not, as you might think, it is not a story about Excalibur. This is from a great writer. I'm quoting a great writer here. The Lady of the Lake is a classic poem by Sir Walter Scott, chronicling the power struggles and the love lives of the British royalty surrounding James V. It is perhaps the poet's most popular and critically received poem, and acted as a symbol for the realism and depth of character he wished to bring to his narratives. So, not having anything to do with Excalibur, but having to do with like love and the politics under James V. That's what this book is. That's what this Lady of the Lake is. And like I said, it had a habit of moving around. And Nancy contacted me because she wanted to include her story having to do with Seven Sisters and with the Scott's house. And actually, this book references it as the Scott house, not Seven Sisters, because she went there to investigate as part of the Taps family. That's why I say I think it's in the wake of it. And so she went there, and all night, this book followed her around. It kept popping up places. It kept appearing when they were investigating one room, and then they'd switch rooms, and they'd come back, and the book would be in that room. Or they would leave a camera unattended, and they would come back, and it would be in the camera's view. Like, this book was tormenting, not in a mean way, throughout the night, right? This idea of like, ooh, like this kept going. And I'm not sure at the time that Nancy knew the history of this, but then the woman kind of told her what was going on with it. So as she's leaving, if I'm remembering the story correctly, as she's leaving, they're packing up their stuff, and the book is in their stuff. And she kind of is like, oh, like, my word, like, and tosses the book out, puts it on the table. And they leave, and she drives home. So it's like about a 2-hour, hour and a half, 2-hour drive. And they get home, and she's unpacking the stuff, and there's the book. And she calls up the woman afterward, and she's like, really, you didn't have to give me the book. And she said, I didn't give you the book. At one point, I can't remember if it was within the house or back at Nancy's house, the book magically appeared on a ceiling fan that was going. And it was moving, and then all of a sudden it was making a weird noise, and they went up there, and the book was in the ceiling fan. So it definitely has this kind of paranormal attachment to it. Nancy kept the book. So last I heard, Nancy had the book. And so she's telling me this story, and she's telling me about the book. And she says, and I was really drawn to the book because I'm really drawn to Arthur legends, and I love the idea of Excalibur and the Lady of the Lake. And I was like, wait a minute, what's the book called? And she said, The Lady of the Lake. And I looked on my desk, and I had the same exact book. And this is what that book looks like. This edition that I have, which is the same edition that she had, was published in, oh my word, how am I supposed to read that? It was published in 18 something. I can't even see. I'm going to say it says 1896, but it might say 1886. 1896, I'm sure, if I'm remembering correctly, has something to do with it. Does this look like a book that a lot of people have? Why do I randomly have this book that she had as well? Right? And she's giving me the interview, and I literally have it on my desk. Why do I have it on my desk? Because it's so friggin' creepy looking that I wanted to include it as just a book, as just a creepy book for the book, for Haunted Objects. And there she is telling me a story for Haunted Objects about her ghostly experiences with her edition of this book. And we always joked about getting the two books together and see if we could, I don't know, make a hole in the space-time continuum or something like that. But it was definitely, yes, Jane, a hashtag follow the signs moment that it needed to be included. And it will be included. We're doing the second edition, not a second edition, but a re-edition, remaking of Haunted Objects. And I'm going to keep that story in. I also have put this forward to be in the Haunted Ocala book. And I'm going to take parts of the story, of Nancy's story with the history and things like that, and put it in the book. So that's the debate. I'm going to throw this out there as a question, so those of you guys who are following can answer the question. You can obviously call in with your opinion at 813-418-622. Do I include this story, and do I include the story of Seven Sisters in the Haunted Ocala book? Now, I've given it a few strikes along the way, if you've noticed. The first strike is there's no real legend attached to it. You have history, and I love history, but there's no legend, right? There's nothing to trip. One of the things I discovered, and I was talking about this, I think last week too, as well, when I was talking about the Ringling, 2 weeks ago, I should say, when I was talking about the Ringling ghosts, and I said, you know, when it was in Haunted Love, the reason that it may have been overlooked or things didn't was because I hadn't legend tripped it. It was one of the only stories in that book I didn't legend trip. And so the connection to it, it was just a really interesting story to me. To me, the story of the book is extremely interesting. The story of Seven Sisters, to me, is friggin' boring. Right? To me, it is someplace that, and I'm not saying it's not haunted. There's no story there, right? The story is just that it's haunted, and here's what the haunting is, right? It doesn't have a pull to me. It doesn't have a narrative that jumps out and begs to be told. It's almost as if it needs to be included because that's what you do. It's like when people talk about bands and they're like, yeah, you know, in the Beatles, and then they go to the band they really want to talk about because they don't really like the Beatles. They just know that you have to mention the Beatles when you're talking about greatest bands of all time. I am a Beatles fan, so that's not me. But what I'm saying is, like, they just have to acknowledge the fact that exists. Why do I have to? I should say, talk about this, in my opinion, cliche haunting. This overdone, uninteresting. There are parts of it that are kind of like cool to me. But most of it is just like there's a hotel and people say it's haunted and they don't know why. And here are the things that happen. And for me, that's not overly interesting. To me, that is cliche. It's overdone. Like, what new thing can I add to it? I've had a lot of struggles with this book in terms of I don't want to write just another ghost book. And I've had good advice on that. People have been like, dude, this is not the kind of book where you're going to experiment and you're going to blow the roof off of paranormal publishing by doing something new and different and exotic. Like, This is one of those books that people just want to pick up and they want a ghost story. And I've struggled with the idea of, is that good enough, right? Is that good? It's like, do I really want to write, like, here, hey, let me tell you about Waverly Hills and the Stanley Hotel, and let me tell you about what's that place, the music store, or let me tell you about even Lizzie Borden. Like, I can bring something original to those stories, but even the book story is not a new story, right? I've written it before. I've told it before. It's in a book. It's in a book that I'm working on at the same time. It's kind of like stealing from myself. It's like the college student who writes a paper about a topic that can be for two different classes. It would involve finding an angle, right? But here's what I struggle with: time investment versus the impact of the story. Is the juice worth the squeeze? Right? That's the famous saying. Is the juice worth the squeeze? To do this the right way, I would need to do a little more research. I would feel as if I had cheated the story to not try to get in contact with some of these people, to obviously talk to Dave again and get his views on it, and other people who have written about it. It involves time. Do I want to invest time in a story that I feel I'm not invested in? That I think is nothing more than smoke and mirrors. Granted, when Ghost Hunters were there, they had a lot of interesting little things happen, but I don't like that stuff, right? I don't like to write about, and then an EMF meter went off, right? And it was kind of cool, right? If you like that thing, the thing was responding to them, and for some reason it didn't like the number 3. I stopped the episode during the reveal, so I don't know if they put the kind of meaning on that I put on that. I am trying to talk myself out of it or into it, because do you have to do the touchstones? Do you have to do the landmark cases? And I guess it's that separation between, I would never go there. If someone said, we're going to go there, do you want to come? I would say yes. If someone said, and I don't know what their room rates are, I think it was $77, but then I tried to book it and it wouldn't work. Would I seek out staying there? Probably not. And regardless of the activity that was there. I would maybe take my kids, because my kids like investigating more than they like legend tripping. But to me, I would find it uninteresting, and I would find it prepackaged and ready to wear. And here's, hey, oh, what do we do? We also have a seance while we're there. And to me, that's not what tripping on legends is. But do you want to read that story? So I know it's different. Books are different than the podcast. Books are different than the Legends Project. Do you want to read that story? If you're opening up a book called Haunted Ocala, and the expectation is that you're going to be reading about stories from the Ocala National Forest and the surrounding area, do you want to read a story that's been done and done and done and done? I looked at the 3 books, and I could be wrong, other than a quick mention in Mark Muncie's latest book. I think it's Freaky Florida. He hasn't done it. I looked at his other 2 books, and I didn't see that whether it was in there. And he mentions it briefly in relationship to some other things in one of his books. In Freaky Florida, I think it is. And I've often walked in the same stories that Mark has walked in, with the idea being that him and I have a completely different approach to the paranormal. So it's completely okay for us to do that because we're not telling the same story. What I'm getting at, or what I'm getting from people who are responding, is that there is a connection between me and this story, or the story and I should say. That hashtag follow the signs, or this being drawn to me. that for some reason, and of course, becoming, I'm not going to say friends, but having a relationship with a man who wrote half the articles about it in the past few months. Coincidence? One of those things that happens just because you're dealing with a small town, so you're going to run into the same person when you're doing your research. It would it doesn't call to me. And I know I'm in its circle somehow. I'm in its wake. I'm in its wave. I'm in its ebb and its flow. I don't even know what that means. But I'm not like, when I heard the story of the magician, and if you haven't listened to that episode, get your podcast wherever you get podcasts. Go back and listen to the episode about the magician. I was so drawn into that. I was like, tell me more. I want to tell that story too. Coyote woman, whether it's a lie or whether it's not, like, mouth on the floor. It's like, what? The bunker stories. This I'm like, no. I had feedback from Natalie when she was reading the book originally, and Haunted Florida Love Stories, and her reaction was, it's not really scary. Probably because I experienced it, right? And so it took some of the ooh factor out of it, and so it's I've done this story, and so maybe the familiarity that I have with it, having told that story 10 years ago, having looked at it again when Tim was like, "Hey, we should redo the book," the bloom is off the rose for me, right? And yet, do you want it, right? Because you partly have to, you have to be a little bit of a whore, right? You have to be a little bit, when you're writing a book, as opposed to just like making a podcast that's completely of your own. You have to give a little bit what they want. If you go and you, if Eddie Van Halen were alive and he was playing a show and he didn't play some of the classic Van Halen songs and just want to play stuff off the new album, you'd be pissed, right? Does the same thing happen in the paranormal? So I know I've got people who buy paranormal books here. Jane has already threatened to beat me with the book if I don't put it in. When you open up a book, and I know I've got people that are in Florida here, I know I've got people who are in New England. If you were to open a book about Massachusetts and it didn't have spider gates in it, would you feel cheated if it covered all of Massachusetts? Or probably more para-horror. I like that word. Although that has a different connotation. That's para-horror always makes me feel like it's someone who is trying to get on television. I'm trying to avoid television because of this bug. If you well, good. Whatever I can do to help. If you open up a book about New England or New Hampshire and it doesn't have whatever that Amherst Cemetery is, or whatever it is in Nashua that is in every book, do you feel ripped off? Ultimately, it's going to come down to if I can find an angle on it, right? If I can find an in, not just the book, but something more. Because as it stands now, I think it's a really interesting story. I could nail out a chapter on it in a night, just with the information that I have from the internet, just with the story that I have, just with my perspective on it. But I kind of... Does the paranormal need its landmarks? Do books need their landmarks? That's the question. That's the question that I've been rolling around the last couple of days. When I do stuff for Midnight FM, they're always saying, give us the show, what you're going to talk about on the show, and so that we can promote it in it. And I think this is the first week I've actually been able to do it because this came into my head very quickly. and it was the idea of doing a show not only talking about the haunting there, but also talking about this pull to not do it. Because I am like Margie, right? Like I like to write about places people have never heard of. Like when I find that new legend, I'm like all over it. And if not, then I'm like, eh, do I really like? I mentioned Ybor City. It's like that place has been so done. Um, if I couldn't find a new angle on St. Augustine, I wouldn't want to do it. I've said these things before. There is the Vano, I think it's pronounced, in St. Pete, which was actually the second part of that Ghost Hunters episode. I didn't even watch that because I know that story backwards and forwards. Also, I think it was in the first book, Ghostly Adventures, I wrote about the Vanoy and like all of the baseball players seeing ghosts and stuff like that. I wish this had lore to it. I wish this had something darker and deeper. Because then I could really sink my teeth into it. As of right now, it's not a ghost story. It's just the story of a ghostly place. And that's a little different. One thing I want to talk about really quickly that I actually totally overlooked when I was telling the story was, for those of you guys who know, so this is the end of that debate unless people want to chime in or call in at 813-418-6822. Several of the people who were going to call have not, so I have a little time. One of the things that I found interesting, and I don't think this could be covered really in the book or presented in the book necessarily, is that this woman, Charlie Childs, seemed to be of Caribbean descent. She was black. She had what sounded like a Jamaican accent, but I don't know the different accents in the different islands, so I'm just going to say she sounded Caribbean. Jane, good point. I'll bring that up in one sec. It's this idea that I had of she seems to be the only one who's been the subject of violence, like she had the chair thrown at her, but also she was saved as well, and I was wondering if that had something to do with the spirits specifically targeting / helping her because of her Caribbean descent. So if you know anything we explored in that episode about Fort King and about the Dade Massacre, this idea that there were Caribbean and freed slaves who were attached to the Seminoles, and they fought with them. It's said that they were the second wave of marauders, if you will, that after the Dade Massacre, they're the ones that kind of then came in and swept in and killed everyone who is still alive. So there's definitely a connection between Caribbean citizens and the Second Seminole War, specifically those opening days of it, and what the Seminoles have become at that point. And so when I watched that, I was wondering whether or not that was maybe somehow playing itself out. All right. Jane says, if someone said, do you want to read about this book that people don't know much about, or Robert the Doll, what do people say? And does one chapter to appease an audience make it worth it? Okay, so I totally parahored it in both books, right? Because Robert the Doll is featured in Haunted Florida Love Stories. Very small part, but I pretty much tell the whole story. And it was kind of like, and my thinking was that I hate it when Jane makes a good point. My theory was that he was the same kind of haunting, the obsession, as another haunting in Key West. So I used Robert the Doll to kind of hook people so that I could then talk about this other, I could talk about the lighthouse keeper. And then, of course, I did it for Haunted Objects, too, because at that time, before the rise of Annabelle, he was the most famous haunted object probably in the world, other than maybe the diamond. Um, so yeah, like I felt I needed to. I guess to some degree, at least in the newest book, I felt that he was a good hook. Like that, not only was he marketable, and you could include some really cool pictures of Robert, but also the idea that that obsession that we so associate with him could be transferred to the other. So I stand it. I'm going to debate. I'm going to debate inside my head. I'm going to overthink it. I've now gone beyond the date for this book. I've had to get an extension on it because these are the things that are playing around in my mind, and I feel like most people, and that's how you set a book. Most people would have just have finished it by now, but there's something detracting me from it as well, which is, of course, a very interesting thing. So a simple story, like I could have written this. In the amount of time that it took to do this show, I probably could have written that chapter if I was focused and listening to like Pink Floyd or something like that. But instead, these debates rage on. And I think that's probably part of the mystique of it. I want to send love out to some people. First of all, I want to thank everyone who I had a really tough anniversary this week, and I was on Sunday. I was down for the count, it was the anniversary of the worst day of my life, and 10-year anniversary. So it was a big one, and I feel that to some degree it was needed that day to be sad. I know it's a really hard thing to imagine, and so many people reached out. And when people reached out, and this was the amazing thing, when people reached out, some were like, sending you hugs, or some was like, I'm thinking about you, buddy, you'll make it through this. Not really understanding the situation that I didn't want to work through it. Like, I needed to be in grief at that moment without being specific about what it was about. But then there was this wave that kind of took over, and it was people telling me stories about myself that they remembered. Like I remember when we were in the 7th grade together and you did this. Or I always think of you as the guy who did. And I was like, I wasn't ready to hear it that day, but the next day I'm reading it and I'm going, wow, like the impact that you can have on people. So I want to send a lot of love out to those who sent love out to me. I just needed strength that day, and a lot of people gave it to me. But also, I want to reach out, and I'm not going to say people's names, but there are a lot of people suffering, and not in like there's so much suffering in the world. I happen to have a small group of people in my life, and many of them are going through traumatic moments right now. Sickness, and families breaking up. And I understand, when people post those ideas of like the relapse rate that's going on right now and things like that, and the suicide rates, and you understand the impact that it's not just you get sick or someone might get sick, but it's the atmosphere, it's the whole thing that's swirling around it, for explained and unexplained reasons. There's the disappearance of Tracy Riker as well here in Southwest Florida. There just seems to be a lot of people who I know who need that love and attention as well. And I just want to ask my audience to, without naming those people, to just send vibes out. I've got it. I'm cool. I don't need any more love. I don't need more vibe. I mean, I always need love, right? And love in. But I don't need vibes anymore. I got it. I've got a strong back. If we can send healing out to those people, because they're people who I care about. And they're having some really tough things going on right now, and they just need like that little extra push, that little extra lift. Everyone should feel like a baby doll, and some people aren't right now, and so I want to make sure that those people get as much healing as they can. And then very specifically, the case of Tracy Riker, who is in many of the paranormal groups that I'm in, the surroundings, and we know a lot of people who know each other, and she's been my Facebook friend for a few years at least, and she's been missing for about a week now. If you don't know the story, you can go to my page or Tripping on Legends, facebook.com/Tripping on Legends, and kind of just scroll through and see the groups and the outpouring for this missing girl, missing woman, who demographically is like so many people who I care about in my life. That this is a really weird time here in Southwest Florida, and I just want to not only send out hopes that she's okay and that she's found, but also if you are in this area, to go to my website or just type into Facebook or wherever Tracy Riker and see what's going on in the case. I'm hoping that by the time this actually goes up, that she's found. But if not, if you can do what you can, whether it's keeping an eye out for, reporting things that you see, go to the facebook.com/Tripping on Legends and see the pictures of her and the links to the groups and things like that, and maybe just kind of keep an eye out, and that's an excellent way for things to be found and things to find a cure for the weirdness that's going on right now. On a positive note, I've got a few things coming up. I'll make sure to keep in touch with you guys about that. Just make sure that you're checking in on Instagram at Spooky Tripping, Twitter at Spooky Balzano. I've said Facebook like 87 times. I'm not going to say it again. But if you want to, from Tripping on Legends, you can also go to, we've got a page for Haunted Love Stories. So it's /Florida, Haunted Florida Love Stories. We've got one for the Ocala Forest if you have stories you still want to share about that. And of course, email me anytime about these things. I'm starting to get those obligatory Bridgewater Triangle stories in your little town paper reports, and half the people never follow up on me or follow up with me on it. And I almost emailed one of the reporters today and said, "So I guess BU School of Journalism doesn't teach you how to be respectful and actually get back people." And thank you for everybody, people like Margie, who are sharing Tracy's story wherever they are as well. Because at this point, with the amount of time that's passed, we don't know where she could be. I got a feeling this story is going to end up in Ocala. That's just the way that I feel about it. And Nancy understands what I'm talking about with some of that as well. Make sure that you're following on all those places so you can see I've got a few events coming up, as well as some pretty cool ideas once October is finished and the book is submitted. I've got some really interesting stories, as well as some really cool ideas for some things I'm going to be getting into. So, for Sir Walter Scott and the Lady of the Lake, for all of my people who have contributed to today's show, and of course for me, Christopher Balzano, thank you for listening to episode 79 of Tripping on Legends, and here's hoping that all of your trips